Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. Happy Transgender Day of Visibility. It is a very exciting day for us. We're very happy to welcome it at the Commonwealth Club. My name is Jupiter Peraza. I have the pleasure of serving Parivar Bay Area as community outreach strategist. And I am very grateful to the Commonwealth Club for allowing us to host this panel on Global South Transgender Day of Visibility. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Parivar President and Chief Executive Anjali Rimi, who could not be here today. So I am stepping in for her to introduce you all and to welcome you all. And you might be wondering, why Global South Transgender Day of Visibility? Well, we have come to notice that much of the coverage and much of the discussions that happen on Transgender Day of Visibility tend to be centered on white trans folks, folks that are U.S. born citizens. We wanted to sort of take a deep dive into a different aspect, into a different perspective of Transgender Day of Visibility. And what better way than highlighting the mission of Parivar, which is the nation's only South Asian-led and South Asian centering organization that takes into account immigrant intersectional diasporas, economic justice, health equity, so on and so forth. And also now Parivar is expanding to include other Global South immigrant diasporas. Me, as an undocumented trans Latina from Mexico, I am definitely someone that resonates with the goal and the mission of Parivar. And I think that there's a lot to understand from the experiences of trans immigrants and asylum refugees. Something that I also wanted to mention is that this conversation is very important because we are now witnessing a lot of anti-trans rhetoric across the country, right? We are witnessing the extremist and right-wing rhetoric that is leading to violence and discrimination. But a different aspect and something worth considering is that what happens when trans immigrants come to the United States, a country that is revered as a safe haven for LGBTQ plus individuals. So what happens when we come to this country only to face further discrimination, right? How is it that the experiences of trans immigrants and asylum refugees is compounded in what is happening here in the United States? And also, what does that say about the deteriorating power of the United States in the world stage? And what does that also say about international foreign policy and asylum policy, right? We are now seeing other countries rising to stand up for trans people, like Spain, for example. So what happens then? What happens when others are rising on this issue while the U.S. deteriorates? So it's important to also take into consideration that, and what better way than the Commonwealth Club that hosts prime ministers, ambassadors, world leaders to have discussions about international foreign policy and other types of international law. So We're very excited to be here. I did want to share Parivar's trailer for their short documentary film called A Family Unlike Any Other. If you don't know, Parivar means family in Hindi. So I wanted us to take a look at this trailer, this brief trailer for you all to get to know a little bit more about Parivar if you don't already. So if we can cue that up. But thank you and welcome everybody.
You've got the hurdle first of needing to convince folks that trans people exist, that trans people need support, and trans people are dying. And the second trust you have to build in them is that I, as a trans woman, can actually be capable of executing this and doing this. And so you're walking a very thin line with folks who are cis, who are very privileged, that look down upon trans people. Parivar Bay Area, or Parivar, is a US-based trans-centering, trans-led organization. We have several programs under our pillars of global disaster relief, community building, and advocacy through arts. SEATL came about as one of our global disaster programs. SEATL stands for Save Indian Trans All India Lives, and it is a grassroots initiative led by trans people on the ground. Our first program was around relief and recovery, when we provided food, rations, medications, and medical kits, and hospitalizations, all sorts of things that affected our trans community who were further marginalized, further neglected and isolated during the pandemic. And very quickly we started going into our second program, which was Livelihoods, which was focused on rebuilding and rehabilitating our trans hijra folks to have an alternate option to what they usually end up having to do, which is survival sex work or Badai and Chella, which were still off limits given the pandemic and the lockdowns and the distancing and such. So our livelihood programs provides trans folks to own projects that allow them to build sustainable incomes, and through that program and that project they're also able to help other trans people learn a skill in that field. To realize that in a country like India, most trans hijra kinner folks live way below the poverty line. So there's a level of class that they don't have, that most cis, lesbian, gay folks do. So when you are thinking of helping them from 7,000 miles away, you have to realize that they don't even have a computer. They probably don't even have a smartphone. They don't even know how to read and write. So you have to get adaptive, creative, and that's why it's very important to have your community leaders who are going to continue the same mission that you have on the ground. And also you have to be able to tell this community that has been relegated to sex work, Badai, Chella, survival sex work, and living in poverty, 13, 14 of them in a tiny 10 by 10 room, that there is support, there is hope, and the work that I'm doing might be a drop in the ocean, but they are not forgotten. There are so many places that I went where they were all like, They would talk to me 5, 10. Sometimes we would be talking for an hour and they'd be like telling each other, "Ye to narin hai na, narin." Narin is a word in the Hijra community that they refer to women, cis women. So more than half of the times, they wouldn't even know that I was a trans woman because they've never seen a trans woman who actually can speak English or who's come from America, who looks like them and is doing this work for them. So Parivar wants to do this work, but we are a grassroots, trans-led, trans-centering organization, and the roadblocks for us to do that work have been many. I think we have to recognize that beyond all of our intersectional identities, being trans is the most marginalized from whatever religion, whatever national origin we come from. So when we are in community, the harm that we can cause is by dividing the community further. Keep all your differences aside. You want to fight for equity, you want to fight for justice, you can do all that, but unless you're going to center, surround, and uplift trans leadership and trans people, you are never going to be truly a trans ally and a warrior for our trans liberation.
Well, hello. Welcome to Transgender Day of Visibility here at the Commonwealth Club of California. And we're here specifically for Global South TDOV. So thank you for all of you for joining us today. I'm Michelle Meow, host of the Michelle Meow Show. For those who are joining us for the first time or here at the club for the first time, the program is focused on social justice issues with an intersectional approach. It's also your A through Z, covering the LGBT, LMNOP, and everyone in between. I'll go ahead and start our panel or program today and have each of our speakers introduce themselves. We'll start with Aishani.
Thank you. I'm Aishani Majumdar. I grew up in India and Indonesia, and I am on a regular day, I'm just Aishani, but today I decided to be visible. I am a marketeer, a businesswoman, and it's been really important for me to bridge all of my identities together and like really own my intersectionality. And I'm just happy to be here and talk about it.
Good, Whit.
Hey everybody, my name is Whit, also known as Joaquin Guerrero. I use he, him pronouns. I like what you said about bridging all the intersections. Well, I'm mixed race. I was born in Mexico. I'm half white. I then grew up in Canada. And then I came here to, pursue my life as a trans leader today. So I'm just representing myself today as a leader of trans rights in San Francisco, and however else I can be helpful. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Amazing. Thanks for being here. And Kavi.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Kavi. Pronouns are he, him. I am born and raised in the Bay Area in the South Bay. I work in digital media and local government, and I am transgender and South Asian, and happy to lend my voice to this Trans Day of Visibility event. And yeah, great to see everyone. Really happy to be here.
Thank you all for being here. Well, we were having a discussion about putting the program together. I really appreciate all of your joy and our smiles and, our resistance that they're not able to take our joy away despite how scary it is when we walk outside those doors. And it's not, I think for most of us, it's not a surprise. But then again, it's 2023, and we're still dealing with this. It almost seems like we're rolling back on a lot of these policies, and we'll get into the laws here in the United States and the policies that continue to discriminate against us. But I want to acknowledge and thank you for continuing to smile and sharing those smiles and joys here on this day. Let's start by having each of you share with us, the lived experiences of folks who are not only transgender, but also asylees, refugees, migrants, and even immigrants. We'll start with Aishani.
Sure. Well, I would love to talk about, asylees and trans intersections. A great example, is my lived experience itself, and I'm not representative of everyone, but it is one story among the many. During the period of 2018 and 2020, around 280,000 people applied for asylum in the US, and only, I think, 11% were granted asylum. I was one of those people. Like I said, I grew up in India, I grew up in Indonesia, and I was suffocated in that society and felt like I couldn't find freedom. And it was a life work to find a way to higher education in America in order to find myself and find the courage and freedom and financial mobility to own this life and create this life. And so it was a grueling process, and it was one process of asylum, and it's very different from someone who's coming in, at the border and applying for a refugee status. But it affects, I know so many people that it's affecting today. It's quite I describe it as a limbo. You're trying to come from another world, another shore, and trying to build a life here, trying to find what you can, how you can grow, spread your wings. But then all of these logistics, legal legislation, logistics are in the way, and that's the limbo piece, right? I had the limbo piece in the beginning where I had to sort of come here, get an education, find a way to talk to asylum lawyers, and build a case in order to apply for asylum. And once I applied for asylum, it went smoothly. And then since then, I've been able to, have a freer life and focus on my medical transition and hormone therapy and surgeries, which wouldn't have happened if I had been stuck in that limbo. And a lot of people are stuck in that limbo while they're applying for asylum, either at the border or they're inside the border and they're applying for asylum with asylum lawyers. And there's so much uncertainty, and it's like a black hole. It's an entire black hole, and there's constantly people trying to wage war on it. So there's so much there, but that's my story, and it's representative of one data point. But yeah.
Thank you. A little bit more about my personal story. Being mixed race, my mom is white, she's from Canada, and she was traveling in Mexico. My dad came from a very direct impacts of recent colonialism from the Spanish in Mexico. So I really grew up seeing a class disparity of the impacts of the colonial history in this North America, right? So that was always a very clear lesson for me since I was a small child. And that kind of led to these kind of social expectations of who and how I was supposed to be, as opposed to being able to be authentic, right? So in Canada, I ended up connecting just by obviously searching and feeling so often out of place in a very white country, not a lot of Latino population. I immigrated when I was 8 and left Mexico at that point, which, as the regular immigrant story is told, as an opportunity for better education. But of course, there's always more to that story. Or it's a trade-off, right? You give up a part of yourself in order to pursue something that might benefit you in the future. I think most immigrant children or parents kind of know that. But yeah, so I was always kind of searching, but I was very much that trans child who cried if I was put in a dress, desperately tried to cut my hair short, so it's things that were really obvious. But for parents who don't understand or are religious, there was just so much confusion and that was very traumatic, you know what I'm saying? So, but ultimately I ended up connecting with some Indigenous leaders in Vancouver, BC, through the harm reduction movement, because I ran away from home when I was 15 to be queer and figure out my gender identity. I didn't know any trans people as a teenager. That came much later. But I knew I would say I know I'm not, gay in this way or queer in this way, but I don't have a word for it. And then eventually that word was trans. So, but anyway, so I went to work with a nonprofit there that had Indigenous leaders, and they said, kind of like, we need you to speak up. And that led me on this journey to kind of try to reconnect with like my father's like Indigenous side, and found out I had a relative actually in the mission after I got here. But mainly what brought me here was like knowing that the history of trans rights really originated here and in New York, but specifically on the West Coast here. So that was my second journey of immigration, but really also of decolonizing myself. And I then went on to direct this housing program in San Francisco, Our Trans Home. I'm no longer there, but at the time, a very large population of the people accessing services of housing and case management were asylum seekers, people coming out of detention centers. And I remember them telling me, there would be one day 10 trans women, trans Latinas specifically, like in Mexico in a detention center, and the next day 2 would leave and then 10 would come. So, just being there for them in those moments that they finally got to get a shelter over their heads, and hearing the stories of what they had to go through, people, traveling by foot from Honduras all the way through Mexico, coming across the border. So many stories like that about trans migrants and the untold truths of what they go through to get here, and then just to have been in that moment where I could see them thrive and really just turn their lives around was such a gift. So I'm super honored to be able to talk about that here today. But I'll pause there.
Yeah. Kavi.
Yeah, it's always so great hearing other trans people's stories, because we have such different journeys, but there's always these motifs that kind of like echo. And I really resonated with a lot of your stories, even though personally mine is a bit different. But I grew up in the US. I was born and raised here in the Bay Area. My parents immigrated from India, and my mom was pregnant with me while she came here. So I was born kind of right on time here, which I'm very grateful for, because I know that my citizenship and my growing up here has granted me a lot of privilege. But I feel like like there's a very unique experience for, South Asian kids or Asian people or any kind of non-white person in growing up in an immigrant family in the US. For me personally, I had a lot of shame growing up. I had a lot of, man, I wish I was white, or I wish I had parents like my white friends' parents, and I had this queerness about me that I didn't understand, and this frustration with my environment that I didn't understand, and was kind of navigating my childhood that way, just feeling misunderstood and that I was just different and weird somehow. And it wasn't until I was a bit older that I started to learn more about LGBT and trans, and it wasn't until I was in college that I really noticed stuff about myself and figured it out that I was trans. It was kind of through meeting trans friends and being like, wow, I wish I was like you. It sounds like a lot of your experiences, resonate with me. And in kind of discovering that it was kind of difficult as well, because I felt like I had to continue distancing myself from my South Asian identity, because there was so much, the way that I understood it was that, South Asian, especially the religious side, really not accepting. And so I felt like I had to choose between my South Asian identity or my trans identity. And at that point, I felt like I had to choose my trans identity. And it wasn't until years later, and understanding myself, and also, as you were saying, Joaquin, like decolonializing yourself, right? And really kind of reaching back into those roots and realizing that it really is because of colonialism and, those kind of historical events that our culture is even so transphobic in the first place, right? And so in making those connections, I realized that it really wasn't about separating the two identities, but really intermingling them and really seeing the way that they are interwoven with each other is where I would find my identity. And so going through that self-discovery process was really interesting, and kind of I really had to question everything that I kind of knew and understood growing up based on my experiences. And I'm still kind of detangling those pieces. There's still a lot of work to be kind of done internally there. But I have just found a new sense of community with this new intersection that I've found. And, you know, through events like this and through organizations like this, it's been so wonderful. And, you know, Michelle, you talked about trans joy in kind of the face of everything. And, you know, today's Trans Day of Visibility, and the way that I feel about visibility is very paradoxical. I feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? With visibility also kind of comes more targeting and more hostility as well. And so on one hand, visibility is a privilege, but on one hand, it can be really scary, right, to go out into the real world. And so finding those intersections, I feel like, is not just about coming to oneself internally, but also like finding your place in the world and finding your community. And so I'm just double grateful for being here and having an event like this.
Let's give a round of applause for our speakers for having the courage to be up here and sharing so much of yourself and being vulnerable at the same time. You know, U.S. immigration policies, historically speaking, are actually racist. They're designed to keep certain people out of this country. And I myself, even, you know, as a citizen of the United States, having been born here to refugee parents, didn't understand that until actually I got married. I got married to a woman, you know, from a different country, and went through the entire process and realized that, wow, the actual only way that you could do this, like legally safe to do, you know, would be to get married, and by heteronormative terms and a very, you know, binary experience, very male female, you know, and so. But, you know, we're not here to talk about me. However, the question, it's a great segue, is to go into, we know that immigration policies are racist and continue to be so, and they're so confusing these days. But how are they transphobic?
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah, I love that you shared that, though. It's so important that we have conversations like this, because as I was going through asylum, like the process, it was so mind-boggling to me that my American friends had no clue how the immigration system works or how their own government works at all. Like I found out like USCIS is almost entirely funded by like the fees that immigrants pay. But to answer your specific question, I mean, transness is such a vulnerable identity in this world. And it is, you know, it is one of the most targeted ones in this world. It's, I mean, growing up ashore, like on a different shore, right? Like you grow up suffocated within yourself, within a society. It's like double suffocation, right? And coming out of that it requires so much that the immigration system in the US isn't built to even contextualize or concept-wise. So going through asylum, for example, when you have to apply for asylum as a trans person, you have to apply under the category of belongs to a social group, not as for gender identity, right? Like LGBT people, trans people, they're all grouped into this like social group that is persecuted. That's entirely left for the immigration officer's discretion and biases to play into. Like the biggest factor of whether you're granted asylum is who you're sitting in front of. It has nothing to do with the persecution you faced. And you have to like document the persecution you faced in a way that appeals to the person you're sitting in front of. And how are you gonna know that? And that needs to change entirely, right? The folks that are coming in at the border, they have no clue about the legal system. They might not even speak English. And they have to document their prescription.
Sorry. Sorry. Excuse me, yes. We're going to allow for our speakers to speak.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's possible, right? And they don't know the US legal system. They don't know how to talk about their persecution in a way that will appeal to the person they're sitting in front of, that will then grant them asylum. They have to, the person that is granting them asylum has this power to give them freedom, but they don't know anything about transness, and they don't understand the violence that trans people face just by being visible. Unlike a lot of LGBT folks, gender is visible, very, very visible. You can't, like when I was applying through asylum, I had to prove that I was trans, and I had to prove that my transness was going to be visible and harmed in my home country. And I was like, what do you mean I'm visibly trans? If I walk on the street, you can see I'm trans. Well, not anymore, but back then.
Yeah.
It, in its entirety, like, is there's no context for, transness. There's no context of the violence we face. And it's constantly like fitting a square into a circle mold. Mm-hmm. That's what it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll pause that.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. I have not been through asylum, so, but as soon as I started working under my mentors for trans rights organizations, it was primarily supporting people from countries in Africa who were fleeing, genocide, essentially being hunted and killed, right? I really learned that that was the focus of the organizations that I was being brought into. And I was a baby, like I didn't know anything. I had just transitioned myself, But once I realized that, and even now, just having a presence on social media, if I'm connected to trans rights stuff, people will be DMing me from other countries and like Uganda and stuff like that, saying they're being persecuted and they just need to like leave their country, right? So it's a lot. It's a lot what's happening. And so if this country is not prepared to receive them with their unique needs to those experiences, we're doing a disservice to an opportunity to really make a difference in people's lives as a global community specifically. So that's something I had to learn is happening. And then additionally, also when I was directing the House, a young trans woman was murdered, and at like 18, and a little bit about some staff members were telling me about her history, and that she actually came from a country in Latin America that, indigenous community that like literally, if you are trans, you will be burnt alive. So a lot of the community members had, helped to support her kind of escape that. And so it's just people don't really necessarily understand also the severity into which the need for resources for asylum seekers is something that we should be investing in significantly. For myself, being exposed to that, and it was like a really huge awakening that has really been driving me forward to do trans rights advocacy. So yeah, thank you for sharing your experience, by the way. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing your experience. I feel like I'm learning so much about the asylum process and the immigration process and how ridiculous it is. I can't speak too much to that because I don't have the experience, but at least in my experience, like being trans and just dealing with systems and how those systems are transphobic in their own sense of being stacked against us, right? Like the way that trans people, like I don't think cis people quite understand the way that trans people have to be essentially humiliated in order to navigate through these systems, because we are told to like do this dance and jump through these hoops, and it's all because we have that trans label in front of us. It's a lot of these things are accessible a lot more easily to cis people and a lot more easily accessible to just a general population. And by having that trans label in front of us, we're then told that we have to go through all these extra steps in order to access these same resources. So not only does there have to be more resources, like you said, but there has to be an easier access to them, especially for trans people. Like being constantly asked to, like you were saying in your experience, like having to prove yourself that you're going through these experiences. Like, it's just so ridiculous in my eyes. Like, how do you even prove something like that you're going through violence, right? It feels so degrading and so humiliating. And in that sense, I feel like a lot of our systems that we face through and that we have to navigate through are kind of inherently transphobic in that way.
I just want to add, thank you for that.
Yeah,
that's really well articulated. There's a piece around dignity. I think that's what I'm hearing. That it's that's the piece that as trans people we're trying to articulate. How do you understand what dignity means for somebody who has an experience that you don't, and how do you represent that in your systemic processes, right? So thank you for pointing that out, because that's something that I want to put a focus on as well, right? Like it's the absence of dignity in the process in which you as a population have to be put through a system that does not have space for you, like you said, putting the wrong shape in, because we haven't carved that space out yet. So thank you for that.
I just want to add too, thank you both for sharing that, because two things, the dignity piece, right? How do you explain to someone that misgendering is painful?
Absolutely.
That is like violence.
Yeah.
Like, how do you explain to someone who's never experienced that? And that is constantly a thing that you have to do in immigration processes, right? And then the second thing is you layer on the cultural piece, like Kavi, you were saying about like being South Asian and trans, and feeling like our culture did not accept us and cannot accept us, and I'm sure you experienced that too. Like I remember sitting in front of a asylum lawyer as I was like looking for asylum lawyers, and this woman happened to be white, and I was explaining like the experiences I had. And she asked me, she's like, okay, but if you like return to India, could you be part of the Hijra community and be free? The Hijra community is the trans community in India, right? And I had to explain to her, and she had no context of India or South Asian culture, but she was an asylum lawyer and claimed to have done so many cases from India. So it was baffling to me that she asked that question, because it was like, I have an undergraduate degree in engineering in America, and if I go back to India and I'm part of the Hijra community, I will not have a job. Do you not get that? So so if you layer the cultural piece to it, it gets even more transphobic, I feel like. So thank you both for sharing that.
Definitely.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I feel like I want to jump in. I want to share so much more, but we're here for you. Kavi, you brought up, the systems in place here. And when I mentioned that it's getting more and more scary, I mean, they're just coming up with all these policies that are outrageous. Access, to the bathrooms, that's always been a thing, but also they're really targeting youths. That's a scary thing, and taking away access to healthcare. I mean, who wants to take access to human beings, who can be healthy away? Well, these people. So let's talk about, how systems, in your own terms, how they impact and affect your lived experiences here. And one of the things that gets lost in the narrative when we talk about the lived experiences of immigrants, even children of refugees like myself, and asylum seekers or asylees, are the social experiences that you have here. Like, we don't talk about how it doesn't get out there. Our identities are compounded by all these other issues, like racism. You leave a country that you will be persecuted for being yourself or being outed. And you get here and you think freedom, and then you experience all these onset of other issues, like I mentioned, racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and in a system. So let's unpack that.
Not to unpack.
Starting with me this time. There's a lot to unpack there. I honestly feel like I have been just very privileged in a lot of ways. I obviously had my struggles, but hearing a lot of stories from other folks, especially other trans people, I realized like how much privilege I do have. And, I have very easy access to healthcare and things like that, especially being in California, I think is a big privilege in and of itself. And so when I think about like these systems and especially right now, there's such an attack on trans people and on trans youth, as you were saying, Michelle, it breaks my heart really, because I feel like all trans people should be awarded the same privileges that I was awarded, the same access, the same safety. And it's really hard, especially in the face of misinformation and disinformation, to kind of combat that, because at least for me personally, like I get very emotional because it's something so close to my heart. And so it gets really hard to have those conversations with people when, especially they have their, predisposed beliefs, or they don't want to let go of what their disinformation that they have. It gets really hard to have those conversations.
And feel free to add this, because a lot of the question I'm asking for us to unpack is also in spaces where you're supposed to feel safe, like, the overall LGBT or LGB, you know what I mean, community. Yeah. And so as a person who's, trans, but then also immigrant or migrant or asylee, and then a person of color, I mean, how does this all share with us these experiences that you may have that doesn't really get talked about a lot?
Yeah, I mean, so I hope I am following, but I will just kind of go with that. I mean, a lot of the advocacy that I've done has been specifically TGNC for that matter, right? Which is that we've seen LGBT resources like housing and different, like resources like that, forget the T, right? So we've been really pushing TGNC and saying like, we're done being erased, like we actually need something just for us. Or we're done, like you saying you're LGBT inclusive and sending white gay men only, who don't care about us, actually. So I think that articulation is something I've been putting forward with specifically city government as well. As far as like what we were talking about, with a lot of the anti-trans legislation being passed right now and those policies, my own experience, it's like, I remember when I came here, one of my colleagues who has behind the scenes done so much for trans healthcare in San Francisco specifically, including that, the coverage by Medi-Cal and all of this, like they worked on it. And when I heard that, I was just like, wow, like you did that, and honestly, like, for a lot of us, like I could speak for myself, like it's just really sad to see the way that people are talking about things like, gender affirming surgeries in states like Kentucky and Tennessee, because like as I remember the few years before my surgery that I was like suffering so much in my body, and it's like, how do you explain to somebody like you said, how do you explain to somebody like, I feel like I'm not going to make it in this state, this change is going to help me? And it was like, after my surgery, I was like, I can breathe. I didn't feel like I started to live until then, honestly. Like, It was really hard to explain that to somebody, to say, and I was, at that age, I was like 29, and I was like, I feel like I'm starting my life today, So to hear all this kind of rhetoric around like people regretting surgeries or like calling it whatever they're calling it, amputations, it's
Botched
like,
mutilation.
right? It's like
horrible.
It's but at the same time, like I try not to get defeated by it, because the reality is the people that are doing this have always been doing this. And I'm very fortunate that I was mentored by Black trans women who, had to literally fight, and so, I don't get discouraged by this. What happened in Kentucky, it was slimy, and they overrode the veto with the microphone off, I heard. And this is white boy games. This has been going on from the dawn of time.
Yeah.
And we just have to be unwavering like our ancestors were. And it is going to be a hard fight, because it always has been. But we have each other, So I just try to stay positive in that sense. But I do think it's important that we remember and that we have these conversations that all those things are connected in the ways that people are strategizing against us. And that is genocide. You know, what I've said is like, for people who don't understand what's happening right now with anti-trans legislation, is that it's an effort to eradicate our existence. But we've gotten us this far, right? So, and that's a long way from where things were, say, 20, 30 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly
Yeah.
where I was going with it.
Right. Okay.
And I didn't want you to leave, you know, a stone unturned if you felt like it wasn't safe enough for us to be even honest with each other, that sometimes within our own community, we are erased or silenced or, treated wrongly, if
Totally.
you will. So.
I love that you said white boy games, because that's what it is, white boy games. It's so interesting, you know, like I came to this country to like find freedom because I was suffocated in my society. And sometimes as these things happen, I'm like, is this better off? Question mark. But I have a lot of privilege, even with all the things I've, you know, experienced. And we all do in this moment right here in this city. And we live in a space where we have access to so much as trans people, you know, sometimes, but it's a hard time for trans youth at this moment. It's a very, very hard time to, you know, experience the little euphorias of starting your transition in an environment that's telling you you're awful and wrong and deranged.
Yeah.
And to them, I think, I mean, we're done being erased. We will not be erased. And we'll do what we have always done, which is like be within our community. And sometimes it has to be, you know, we have to uplift within just the trans community. Because like you said, like sometimes the LGBT community don't understand the issues that we're facing, you know? And to trans youth, like it's so, I saw this video come out today from, I think Them, the media outlet, that was just so powerful. It was saying, you know, how we have always persevered with the strength and power of our community being together, and we've survived everything and will continue to survive. And that's what's most important. But when will it stop? When will it stop for us to have to reframe it like that? Why is it constantly a war against us with like one example that is an outlier, that's taken out of context, like this trans shooter? But it's just a hard time for trans youth at this moment, but we will persevere. I'm sure of it.
I hear from all three of you that, you know, we keep coming back to our strengths, which is we have community, we have each other, even when we feel excluded, and we're just not going to go away, or we're not going to let them, you know, erase us in this way. How do you, I guess, where do you draw that within yourself, and then how you organize that within the rest of the community to kind of, you know, keep fighting? Yeah. Do we have a choice?
I can start us off. I was fortunate, like, you know, I feel like when I came out as trans, I went on this like journey where I was like, okay, this is what this is that I'm dealing with. Like, I'm either not gonna make it, or I'm gonna just go all the way with this. I was completely lost. I didn't have anyone to turn to. Honestly, I was fortunate I had some friends, you know, people in my life were like allies and stuff, but I just didn't feel that I had the right people. You know what I'm saying? As a young person and this was in my early 20s, because I knew I was gender nonconforming looking back, but I didn't have the language. And then at 20, I tried to come out, and then I was discouraged by queer people in my life who, you know, that's just, they didn't know what they were doing. So I was discouraged, and then it was at 24 that I was like, okay, this is it. But I managed to just search so much that I found people who taught me the trans legacy. And I think that that's the piece that a lot of young trans folks, you know, I was directing a trans peer-based organization. And there was a lot of young trans folks in their like early 20s. And I remember I asked them, like, do you have relationships with your elders? And a lot of them didn't, and they were really yearning for that. So I think that kind of like, I remember when I was feeling really suicidal around the time I came out, and I said, you know, I was in so much pain because I didn't know anyone who had survived something harder than what I felt like I was experiencing in that moment. But later in life, like, I did find those people, and they were my elders, and they taught me a certain legacy of survival, which was that of family and sharing this kind of family love that a lot of trans youth don't get from their biological families. You know, whether their families love them or not, it's a way that people don't know how to love trans children. And fortunately nowadays, a lot of trans parents have access to the education that they are doing that, and all the power to them. And they are also under attack currently. But I guess just to bring it back to your question, it's like holding on to the culture of trans survival and the culture of trans legacy, which, you know, we now have shows like Pose and what's the other one? Love and Nino, like things like that, you know? So that really capture those histories of how people took care of each other when there was so much discrimination. So I think being able to capture those through art or documentation and through relationship and continue to teach those to younger generations is, I think, what's gonna allow us to like kind of reach back and pull them up through this hard moment in history, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how I try to look at it.
Kavi?
Yeah. I think it's tricky for me personally, because I think it's a little bit of a balancing act for me to kind of find the middle ground of, you know, fighting back against those systems and trying to, you know, be that wall of protection for the trans community, and also like, you know, setting down the pitchfork sometimes and actually like taking care of people within the community and like uplifting people. Because I feel like a lot of people sometimes, and I see this especially with allies, they tend to focus on one more than the other, focusing more on, you know, attacking transphobic people or speaking out. And that's all necessary and needed and absolutely great that they're doing that. But there has to be the other side of that too, which is turning back around and taking care of and uplifting the trans people who are in need. Mm-hmm. And so for me personally, like, I've found the most like strength and hope when I do that kind of work, when I do turn to my own community and say like, okay, what can we do for each other and uplifting each other? And I feel like that's just so important, and what I personally prefer to focus on, especially when faced with this kind of onslaught that can feel really hopeless to deal with sometimes. And it can also, for me, be important to remember that there are so many people like doing that work as well, even if it's not necessarily me all the time. Like, it seems like Joaquin is doing amazing work. So thank you for all of that. But, you know, there's so many people on the front lines like you who are doing such amazing work. And so I turn to you, and I turn to our elders and all of those people who are doing the kind of hard stuff. Meanwhile, I can kind of turn back around and focus on the community and take care of us. But I feel like both pieces are absolutely necessary, and especially for, you know, those who might not be TGNC and maybe LGB or any other kind of allies. I feel like sometimes one tends to get forgotten. So really want to emphasize the importance of both, you know, pushing back and fighting against transphobia and our transphobic systems, while also looking inward and uplifting and taking care of our own too.
I want to echo both of what you both said. Thank you so much. I love that. Especially taking care of the community. Mm-hmm. Like, I wish for a soft life for us, where we're not all fighting all the time, where we don't have to fight all the time. That's the utopian society that we're working towards. But until then, I love the idea of the elders, you know, that our community is where we get our strength. We've done this again and again through the decades, through the generations. And it's those stories of resilience. I personally, you know, found my community that helped me. I mean, you know, through Parivar, through, I have a trans mother, you know, that is my chosen family. She has helped me a lot. I personally have trans daughters that I often share stories, you know, to, and I like saying resume of resilience a lot. And it's like, you know, everything that's like behind the curtains of what we've done, what our paper resume is. And it's like how we've persevered through all the challenges, everything that's happened in the background. Because I don't think people realize how intense transition is. It's not just like identifying and like using some pronouns, unless, you know, that's your journey. But even the internal work that it takes to spread your wings and live a life that you're trying to live, it's truly resilient. And sharing those stories, I love like collecting those stories for myself and sharing those with my community, because that's where I find strength.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks all three for sharing. Yeah, we're going to bring it back to just the experiences of those of us, or especially a focus on Global South, migrants, refugees, immigrants, and let me back up. You know, I had this conversation, it's an interview with someone, a friend who is an activist from Uganda, and it was the day that they had announced that they were bringing back we call Kill the Gays bill. And we were all in Sydney for World Pride, and so, you know, we were talking about what was going on, and he said, I kind of feel like I shouldn't go back home. And I said, I don't think you should. I think you should just squat here and do what you need to do and don't go back to Uganda. I think they're going to pass the bill. And that, sure enough, they did, right? Yeah. So for those who don't know, Uganda has passed one of the most terrible and harshest anti-trans bills, anti-LGBTQ bills. It could be life in prison and or the death penalty in some cases. And I had to really think about my comment, though, because I said, yeah, just squat here or come to the United States and just stay there, you know, and without even thinking about what other experiences I might be putting this person through that isn't necessarily part of this privilege experience that I have, you know, in that sense. So the question back to you all, is how we, because we are sitting in positions of privilege compared to some of our trans brothers, sisters, siblings, how do we inform, how do we engage the rest of the world when we say, you know, fight back against these, I call the evil axis of powers, we know the influence of anti-LGBTQ policies actually stems from the Western world. How do we inform and advocate for a better foreign policy so that those who are in countries that continue to persecute, especially trans folks in the Global South, you know, what kind of work can we, even if it's small, as privilege, and I'll kick us off, for example. That's one, is just to educate myself on, you know, that you have to understand the cultural nuances before you throw out big, sweeping recommendations like, just go squat in the United States and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I love that question. There's so much we should be doing because, you know, growing up abroad, and coming here, I realized like how clueless a lot of Americans are about the world. I'll say that. And it's firstly informing ourselves, you know, about what's going on in the world, like you said, the cultural context, right? And understanding the world, understanding the different experiences, and then having conversations. These conversations are so important, you know, and in different formats to reach the people that are facing these issues abroad, right? So I try to use my voice as much as possible so someone like me in India can learn from that and find hope in that. But that's one aspect within the community, right? And then it's demanding like training and education within the immigration systems of the world, right? Take examples of countries who are a little farther along, like Sweden, Spain, you know, their asylum processes have some better policies in terms of trans education, in terms of trans contexts. And it's important to take those examples and bring it here, and then also impact other countries, because it's a global, we should all be walking this line together into protecting trans people everywhere. And then there are some outliers that are just not going to protect us, and to safely get the trans people out of those outlying cultures and put them in places where they can be. And that's so unfortunate, because when you take a trans person out of their culture, they're losing their culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're losing their culture.
Yeah.
And they're choosing one aspect of their identity. And how do you bridge that? For me, I've done it through Parivar, but that's not always accessible. So that's my take.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. That last point that you made is just critical. And I try to bring it back to like decolonizing ourselves, because the reality is that a lot of third gender people were, revered in previous cultures and had specific roles in community that we played that were honored. So it's like, how do you do that kind of education? But as far as like advocating for those, how to address this issue that you're talking about, I think there are amazing trans organizations that are creating systems of support, and I've literally with my own eyes have seen transform trans people's lives, and who then go on to become like doctors and nurses and like, you know what I'm saying, in this country too. And that's positive and effective. It's just these organizations are small and few, and I think that the country and different states need to invest in those organizations and supporting them in the work that they're doing. So I would start there, because it's already happening. It's been happening. They just need more support a lot of the time and more capacity. So that's one piece, demonstrating the impacts that those services can have on community.
Totally. 1,000%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely echoing everything you both have said so far. I completely agree with everything, like giving support to organizations, education. I think those are all crucial pieces. I think a really big one that people tend to forget is money, right? I mean, like, if people have the ability and have the privilege to do so, like giving money to organizations, but also giving money directly to trans people, right? Like people who are seeking healthcare or seeking immigration, all those things, there are avenues to do so. And I really encourage people to give money, because that's something that we really need, and something that, people tend to not think about. And it's an easy thing too. And I think it's so crucial and so needed. So I think all those pieces are absolutely necessary. And I think like all of what you said are really great for allies and LGBT allies and cis allies. I would also say, like, for trans people specifically, like, just kind of keep your peace is kind of my advice to trans people. Like, if you can't do the fight, like, don't do the fight. And if you can only do certain things within your capacity, like, only do those things, because, like, your existence is so precious, and we don't want to burn ourselves out in this process too, right? So I would say, like, really, allies and LGBT community, like, really do the heavy lifting for us most of the time, like, listen to us, uplift us, but, like, get your hands dirty. And for trans people, I would say, like, just keep being yourselves. And I feel like that's one of the most radical things that we can do. My mind also kind of jumps back, and I feel so terrible that I can't remember this person's name or where this was, but there was a video that went viral a little while ago of a trans person going to, like, a local, like, city council meeting or something like that to speak out against some local legislation that was being done to restrict the healthcare in their state. And this person had come up and spoken about his experience with healthcare and how vital it was for him. And in front of the entire council and the entire crowd that was there, he, like, took his testosterone injection in front of everybody. And I saw that video and I was like, this is the most amazing, radical, badass thing of, like, I've ever seen in my entire life. And I just, like, had so much respect for that individual. And I feel like just those kind of just being visible and really just showing, like, we are here and we're not going to be erased in those kind of ways, I feel like is such a powerful method of resistance that we can do just by existing.
Yeah.
I love, yeah, go
I
ahead.
just want to echo Kavi's point about the money aspect.
Yes.
I wish there were more organizations that are like helping. I mean, there are organizations that are helping trans people apply for asylum, right? But like also alleviating some of the barriers, right? You can, for an immigrant coming into America and applying for asylum, after you apply for asylum, you will get a work permit to sort of get employment and support yourself. But a lot of the times, there's so many barriers to that, right? To getting access to finances. I wish there were more organizations that help alleviate some of that. And if you can't find organizations, find trans people that are either going through that process. You know, going back to when I was applying for asylum, I was a student in undergrad, and I was taking on internships part-time during the semester and working all the time to pay legal fees in order to apply for asylum. Yeah, just more money in trans people's hands as they're going through processes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that brings up the issue of equity, right? Because even if you are like, okay, here, come on here, you still have to start from such a farther back place that, equity is really important, especially financially. So San Francisco just passed the first trans and gender nonconforming, I think, GI program, the GIFT program. So general income for trans people. It's the pilot, so hopefully it sticks around. But I think that's another piece in which, financial equity will support people in being able to thrive.
Yeah.
These are all such great examples. And by the way, the money part, at the end, we'll show you the collection of organizations who are with us today. And so if you're tuning in online, you're here and you're an ally and want to support, all these organizations need your help. I'm going to start to wind down my questions. So if you're here and would like to ask the speakers a question, we'll start to collect those questions, but give us a minute to wind down. I'll walk around with a mic to get your questions. I think one of my last questions really, today is such a significant day, and it started with a significant reason to do so. But now, especially here in America at least, the general public is interested in the day. And there are campaigns and all this stuff now. And it was really hard for me. And I knew what I'm going to do as a cis ally on TDOV. I'm showing up here and, supporting programs like this. But I oftentimes wondered what the rest of the other communities, what are they doing? They're posting stuff on Facebook. So this is a big question. It's to me today is about members of my community and what I need to continue doing. What does this mean to you, though? What does TDOV mean to you, and what you would wish for the rest of the world who's kind of now like, oh, it's TDOV, I'm going to take a picture with my trans friend and post it. What it means to them. Yeah. I think you get my question.
Yeah. I can start us off. Within community, I think we're doing what I hope we'd be doing, is just being visible within community and sharing those stories of resilience. That's where we find our strength. But then outside our community, it's so funny you say, take a picture with my trans friend. I've actually had that happen before. And I've communicated to everyone. I was like, this is not what it's about. Mm-hmm. Do the work. If there's any day that you do the work for trans people, it's today. And TDOR, right? Donate to organizations, find those organizations and donate to those organizations, because get money in the hands of programs that can help alleviate the barriers for trans people. Not just post about it, actually have real conversations. If there's people in your life that hold prejudiced feelings about trans people, you owe it to the trans people to have those conversations. Have those conversations. It's difficult to have it with your grandmother, your aunt, whatever. But if you want to support a trans person, have those conversations. Because that's one person at a time, you're changing something. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Totally. And I'm glad you said the piece about education. For me, I think I'm just so happy to be here with other trans folks today. I remember when I started transitioning, visibly looking different, I was trying to be stealth, and I was super anxious. And then after a certain point, I just started telling everybody that I was trans all the time, you know? And that was so liberating for me, because, you know, I think some of the girls use the butterfly icon, and my partner who's in the audience and I talk about how it's, you know, a caterpillar doesn't just go into a cocoon and then grow wings. It's like it turns into goo and then it turns into a butterfly. And so for me, like, TDOV is about like fully self-love. You know, I had to let go of any inhibitions that I had about who I was in order to be myself fully as a trans person. So TDOV for me is about that empowerment to be fully okay with myself and to look at my trans colleagues and brothers and sisters and say, yes, we are, and we don't have to hide, actually. But I agree that it just requires, especially like in, I'll say, organizations that are trying to uplift, but actually are extracting from trans people, stop doing that.
Yeah.
Like, whoever that white man, white cis woman is, like holding their thumb over trans people of color in leadership, you need to confront them and tell them to stop, because it's our turn to lead our own fight and our own movement, and it's still not happening. So I'll leave it there.
Might have been our mic drop moment, but yeah. Kavi.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to follow that. Definitely echoing what these two have said so far already. Yeah, I think also for me, you know, like I said at the beginning, visibility is kind of this like double-edged sword, right? It can be really empowering while also kind of putting this target on our backs. But I'm also just so grateful for that privilege to be visible and be here with all of you, but also for all of you being visible, and for me to be able to see you all and our community and our elders and everyone be their visible selves, because that also does empower me as well. So I'm just so grateful for that and to be a part of everything.
Well, I want to thank this entire panel, you know, for sharing again, for your vulnerability and for Trans Day of Visibility, and also the fact that, yeah, it is a double-edged sword. And we're in this together, and there are many of us who want to be a part of this community and are going to ride the ride. Thank you to all of you who are joining us here in person at the Commonwealth Club for today's Global South Transgender Day of Visibility event.
Thank you.